Welcome to CSS Breakdown, book by book, where in Season 09, Episode 19, we open the pages of Norman Lowe's Mastering Modern World History to unravel one of the most transformative and turbulent periods in Chinese history, the path from empire to communist rule. This deep dive, it's quite an incredible journey we're embarking on. We're looking at the early 1900s, right up to 1949. Think about it, a country, China, steeped in millennia really, of imperial tradition, and then suddenly it's just ripped apart. Internal struggles, massive foreign interference, civil war, and out of all that chaos emerges this entirely new power structure. It's a dramatic shift, almost hard to wrap your head around.
It really is. And Norman Lowe's book, Mastering Modern World History, is a fantastic guide through this really pivotal era. What Lowe does so well is distill these incredibly complex decades, into a narrative that's clear but also comprehensive. We'll see how China tried to deal with this relentless foreign pressure, how fragmented so badly during the Warlord era, and then ultimately how these two competing ideologies, the nationalists and the communists, battled it out, leading to that communist victory in 49.
Okay, so let's unpack this a bit. Before all this upheaval, China, under the Manchu or Qing Dynasty, had, centuries of relative peace, right? Pretty isolated.
Largely, yes. For a long time, it was quite stable, mostly self-sufficient. But that foundation started cracking around the mid-19th century.
Started it. What were those first cracks?
It was really a combination of things piling up. A perfect storm, you might say. First, just sheer numbers. The population absolutely exploded. We're talking going from maybe 140 million to over 400 million in about a century. That led to massive food shortages, not enough land, and naturally, banditry, chaos, just widespread internal strife. That alone was a huge destabilizer.
Okay, so internal pressure building up massively.
Exactly. And then the foreign powers, particularly Europeans, saw this vulnerability. They saw an opportunity. Britain, especially with the Opium Wars in the 1840s, basically forced their way in. China had to give up Hong Kong, open up ports for trade, and once Britain did that, other Western nations jumped in too, grabbing concessions, carving out influence in, something like 80 different ports.
That sounds less like opening up trade and more like, economic and political invasion, really. I've heard that story, maybe it's not entirely true, but it speaks volumes, about the sign outside a British park in Shanghai, "No dogs are Chinese."
Yes. That specific sign, the historical consensus is it probably didn't exist exactly like that. It's likely apocryphal. But the fact that the story caught on, that it resonated so deeply with ordinary Chinese people, that tells you everything about the level of outrage, the humiliation, the deep resentment people felt about this foreign presence, and the inequality it represented.
Being treated like second-class citizens in their own country.
Precisely. And while all this is happening externally, internally, China is also dealing with huge rebellions. The Taiping Rebellion is a major one. It lasted 14 years, based on a kind of Christian-inspired ideology mixed with political reform, caused immense devastation in the south. But what's really significant strategically is how it was put down. It wasn't the central Manchu government troops, who were pretty ineffective by then. It was newly formed regional armies loyal to provincial leaders.
Okay. So the Taiping Rebellion wasn't just another uprising. It actually weakened the central government's grip on power.
Absolutely. It showed the provinces they could raise their own forces, manage their own affairs. It fundamentally shifted the balance of power away from Beijing. It really foreshadowed the Warlord era even decades before it officially started. Power was already decentralizing.
And the hits kept coming for the Qing Dynasty, didn't they?
They did. Defeat by Japan in 1895, losing Formosa, which is now Taiwan. Then the Boxer Rising around 1900, this sort of anti-foreign uprising, brutally crushed by an international army, leaving China with huge compensation payments to make. And more territory lost after the Russo-Japanese War a few years later. By the early 1900s, the dynasty was, it was clearly on its last legs.
And it's in this climate, this desperation, constant foreign pressure, internal weakness, that you see this real hunger for radical change, right? Especially among young Chinese who'd studied abroad. They came back with revolutionary ideas.
Exactly. Ideas about democracy, modernization, getting rid of the Manchus. Dr. Sun Yat-sen is probably the most famous figure here, championing a Western-style democratic republic.
Did the Manchu government try anything? Any reforms?
They did try some reforms, yeah. Even promised democracy eventually, set up elected provincial assemblies. But it was far too little, far too late. If anything, those assemblies just gave the provinces more power, more reason to assert their independence from Beijing, which was deeply unpopular by then.
So the spark finally ignites. Where?
In Wuchang, October 1911. It starts among soldiers, a mutiny really, but it spreads like wildfire. Province after province declared independence from Beijing. The whole imperial system just collapsed.
And the imperial family calls in General Yuan Shikai, a powerful military figure. They hope he can save them.
Right, he was a retired general, very influential, but Yuan saw his chance. He wasn't interested in saving the dynasty. He made a deal with revolutionaries. Basically, he said, I'll ensure the emperor abdicates peacefully and the dynasty if you make me the first president of the new republic.
Wow. So he plays both sides and comes out on top.
Pretty much. The last emperor, Puyi, just a child, abdicated. The Manchu dynasty ended, and Yuan Shikai became president in 1912.
But he wasn't exactly a democratic leader, was he?
Not at all. He ruled essentially as a military dictator from 1912 to 1915. And during this time, Japan really took advantage of the chaos, especially with Europe distracted by World War I. Japan issued what they called the 21 demands in 1915. These were incredibly harsh. Group 5, the most extreme part, would have basically turned China into a Japanese protectorate, Japanese advisors controlling everything.
Did Yuan accept them?
He managed to resist that specific demand, Group 5. But Japan was playing a longer game. They secretly offered to support Yuan's personal ambition, which was to become emperor himself.
He wanted to restore the monarchy, but with himself on the throne.
Exactly. Japan figured an emperor who owed them his throne would be just as useful as direct control.
That sounds like a massive miscalculation on Yuan's part. How did that go down?
It was a disaster for him. When he actually announced his plan to become emperor in late 1915, there was huge public outcry. People felt betrayed. This was supposed to be a republic. His support just vanished. The army turned against him. He was forced to abandon the plan, abdicated his presidency, and died just a few months later in 1916.
And his death is the trigger for
The Warlord Era, 1916 to 1928. With Yuan gone, there was no single figure strong enough to hold the country together. China just disintegrated. Hundreds of small states, basically, each run by a local warlord with his own private army. Constant fighting, immense suffering for ordinary people, especially the peasants. Just chaos.
utter chaos. But even amidst that, Lowe just points out a couple of maybe positive developments, or at least significant ones, like the May the 4th movement.
Yes, 1919. That was really significant. It started as a huge student demonstration in Beijing. They were protesting against the warlords, against aspects of traditional Chinese culture they saw as holding China back. But the immediate trigger was the Versailles Treaty after World War I. The treaty gave Germany's former concessions in China's Shandong province to Japan.
So China was supposed to be on the winning side of WWII, but they still lost territory to Japan.
Exactly. The sense of betrayal and humiliation was immense. It sparked this incredible wave of patriotism. Student strikes, boycotts of Japanese goods, workers joined in with general strikes. It was this massive nationwide outpouring of feeling that actually forced the weak Beijing government to back down. They released arrested students and refused to sign the Versailles Treaty. It showed the power of popular nationalism.
A real awakening of national consciousness. And the other development.
The rise of the Kuomintang, the KMT, or Nationalist Party, founded back in 1912 by Dr. Sun Yat-sen. Their goal was clear: a modern, united, democratic China, free from foreign control. Sun had his famous 3 principles.
Right, nationalism, democracy, and the third one was about livelihood.
People's livelihood, yeah. Nationalism meant getting rid of foreign influence. Democracy meant eventual rule by the people after a period of education and tutelage. And people's livelihood was a bit vague initially, but essentially about social welfare, land reform, tackling that deep peasant poverty.
Sun was respected, but didn't have much power initially.
He had huge intellectual respect, but lacked military muscle. That came later. But the KMT gradually grew stronger, organizing, building support. By 1928, they'd actually managed to bring most of the warlords under their control, at least nominally unifying the country again.
It's interesting, though, that intellectual debate sparked by May 4th, modern ideas versus traditional Confucianism. You mentioned the KMT later started promoting Confucianism.
Yes, it's a bit ironic. Later on, especially under Chiang Kai-shek, the KMT embraced Confucianism partly for its conservative social values and perhaps as a way to differentiate themselves ideologically from the communists who were completely rejecting the past.
Okay, so let's talk about Chiang Kai-shek. He takes over the KMT after Sun Yat-sen dies in 1925. He seems like a strong military figure, which maybe China needed. But you mentioned his leanings.
That's right. Chiang had military training. He studied in Japan, even visited Russia to study their military and party organization. He headed the KMT's military academy initially with Russian help.
So some ties to the Soviets early on.
Yes, but ideologically, Chiang was firmly on the right. He became increasingly anti-communist very quickly. His power base was more with, businessmen, landowners, the conservative elements. He purged left-wingers from the KMT.
This tension must have been there during the Northern March, right? That campaign from 1926 to 28 to defeat the warlords.
Absolutely. Initially, the KMT and the Small Chinese Communist Party, CCP, were actually allied in this northern march. They worked together.
And they were successful.
Incredibly successful. They marched north, capturing major cities, Hankow, Shanghai, Nanking, eventually Beijing. Unity seemed possible. A lot of their success, especially in winning popular support, came from the communists working within the alliance. They promised land reform, organized peasant associations.
Gaining massive peasant support.
Huge support. And at Shanghai, it was actually communist organizers like Zhu Enlai who led a massive industrial workers' uprising that helped the KMT take the city.
But this success made Chiang nervous.
Deeply nervous. He saw the communist influence growing, saw their appeal to peasants and workers. He decided they were becoming a threat to his leadership and his vision for China.
So what did he do?
In 1927, he turned on them, brutally. He launched what was called the Purification Movement. He expelled all communists from the KMT, and then came the massacres. Tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands by some estimates, of communists, trade union leaders, peasant organizers were rounded up and killed.
A complete betrayal of the alliance.
A complete and bloody betrayal. It devastated the Communist Party, drove them underground or into the countryside, and allowed Chiang to consolidate his power, establishing his government in Nanking.
This seems like a potential endpoint for the communists. But it wasn't. This is where Mao Zedong really steps into the spotlight, isn't it?
Exactly. The CCP was shattered, especially in the cities. But Mao Zedong, who came from a prosperous peasant background, had a different idea. He'd been an organizer, studied Marxism. He argued, against some others in the party, that the revolution's future wasn't in urban uprisings, which had failed disastrously after the split with the KMT.
Where was it then?
With the peasants. He believed the CCP needed to go to the countryside, win over the massive peasant population, build rural bases, and develop a peasant-based Red Army.
A fundamental shift in strategy.
A pivotal one. And Chiang knew it was dangerous. From 1930 to 1934, he launched 5 huge military campaigns, extermination campaigns he called them, to wipe out Mao's rural Soviets in the mountains of Jiangxi province. The communists fought back, developed guerrilla tactics, but by 1934, Chiang's 5th campaign, using German military advice, was succeeding. Mao's base was completely surrounded. They were trapped.
Facing annihilation.
Pretty much. Mao realized their only option was a desperate breakout, to escape the encirclement and find a new, safer base somewhere else.
And this breakout becomes the Long March.
The legendary Long March, October 1934. Nearly 100,000 communist soldiers, party officials, civilians started this incredible, grueling retreat.
The numbers are just staggering, covering something like 6,000 miles
Roughly.
over a year.
Roughly, yes, about 6,000 miles, took 368 days. They crossed 18 mountain ranges, 24 major rivers, fought constant battles with KMT forces and local warlords, faced starvation, disease. It was unbelievably harsh.
How many survived?
Only a fraction. Maybe fewer than 10,000 reached the final destination, a remote base in Yan'an in Shaanxi province in the northwest.
So, militarily, a disaster in terms of numbers lost. But symbolically?
Symbolically, it was immense. It became this epic story of survival, resilience, dedication to the cause. It cemented Mao's leadership within the party. Now, there is some historical debate. Young Chiang and John Halliday, in their biography of Mao, argue the march was heavily exaggerated, even that Chiang deliberately let them escape sometimes.
Really? Why would he do that?
Their theory is complex, maybe to herd them towards areas where they'd clash with other warlords or for other strategic reasons. But most general historians, while acknowledging the CCP certainly mythologized the march, tend to dismiss the idea it was all some kind of fantasy or allowed by Chiang.
So the standard view is it was a genuine, incredibly difficult feat of survival.
Yes. And regardless of the debates about the details, the outcome is clear. The communists survived. They reached a secure base, and over the next decade from that base in Yan'an, they rebuilt their strength and gained enormous popular support while the KMT struggled.
Which brings us right to that core question. Why? Why did the communists ultimately win? The KMT seemed stronger, had international recognition, even U.S. aid later on. What went wrong for them and right for the CCP?
It really comes down to contrasting approaches and effectiveness. The KMT government under Chiang, well, it just didn't deliver for most Chinese people. It was often inefficient, plagued by corruption. It focused on supporting industrialists, bankers, landowners, its own base, but failed to really organize mass support or implement meaningful reforms for peasants or workers.
So conditions didn't improve much for ordinary people.
Not significantly. Factory conditions remained awful. Laws were supposed to protect workers, but they were rarely enforced. Bribery was common, and Chiang didn't want to upset his business supporters. And in the countryside, peasant poverty was still rampant. You had terrible droughts in the 1930s, famine. But often food was hoarded by merchants. Peasants faced high taxes, forced labor. The KMT didn't solve these fundamental problems.
And the CCP offered an alternative.
A very attractive one, especially their land policy. Initially, in their early bases, they confiscated estates from big landlords and redistributed the land. That was obviously popular with poor peasants. Later, especially during the war with Japan, they moderated this policy. Instead of outright confiscation everywhere, they focused on reducing rents, limiting interest rates, and ensuring even the poorest got some land.
A more pragmatic approach.
Very pragmatic. It won them support not just from the poorest peasants, but also from middle peasants, and even some smaller landlords who felt protected from excessive demands. It built a much broader coalition of support in the countryside.
What about that New Life movement Chiang launched in 1934, trying to revive Confucian values? Did that help?
Not really, no. As the historian Raunemeter points out, it seemed pretty trivial to many people. It focused on things like etiquette, hygiene, being orderly, which, might sound okay, but compared to the massive problems China faced, poverty, foreign aggression, it felt completely out of touch.
Like fiddling while Rome burns.
Kind of. And many progressive Chinese, the sort inspired by the May the 4th movement, saw it as a step backward, embracing old traditions instead of modernizing. It probably alienated more people than it won over.
Okay, so KMT weaknesses, CCP's strengths and policy. But you said the most crucial factor was Japan.
I think Lowe's, and many historians would argue yes. The KMT's handling of the Japanese invasion was probably the single biggest reason they lost popular support. Japan had already seized Manchuria in 1931. They were clearly preparing to move further into northern China, but Chiang's priority remained fixed. Destroy the communists first, then deal with Japan.
Which must have infuriated a lot of Chinese patriots.
Absolutely. It led to the Xi'an incident in 1936. This was extraordinary. Chiang flew to Xi'an to pressure his own generals, many of the Manchurians who had lost their homes, to step up the anti-communist fight. Instead, they took him prisoner. They demanded he stop the civil war and form a united front with the CCP to fight Japan.
His own troops kidnapped him.
Yes, it was a huge crisis. Eventually, Zhu Enlai flew in from the communist side to mediate. After intense negotiations, Chiang reluctantly agreed. A second united front was formed.
How did this alliance help the communists?
Immensely. First, it forced Chiang to stop his extermination campaigns against them. It gave them breathing room, secured their base in Yan'an. Then, when full-scale war with Japan broke out in 1937, the KMT armies bore the brunt of the initial Japanese onslaught. They fought bravely in some cases, but were often poorly led and equipped. They suffered massive defeats and had to retreat deep into the interior, moving the capital westward multiple times.
While the communists,
based in the north, weren't defeated. They stayed in place and waged a highly effective guerrilla campaign against the Japanese in occupied areas. This allowed them to portray themselves very successfully as the true patriots, the ones really resisting Japan effectively, while the KMT seemed to be losing.
So they won the propaganda war, basically.
And the support war. Peasants, middle classes, intellectuals flocked to their banner. They were seen as disciplined, less corrupt, and genuinely fighting for China. The growth was phenomenal. Lowe cites the numbers. From controlling about 12 million people in 5 base areas in 1937 to nearly 100 million in 19 base areas by 1945. They used the war years brilliantly to expand their influence.
It's important to remember that perspective you mentioned from Jay Taylor, though, that maybe Chiang faced impossible choices.
Yes, that's a fair counterpoint. Taylor argues Chiang understood the deep weaknesses of China. The threat of both Japan and the communists may be better than his American allies did. And that governing under those conditions was incredibly difficult, perhaps making some of his harsh decisions seem, if not justified, at least understandable from his perspective. It wasn't simple.
Okay, let's shift to the end of World War II. China was officially one of the Allies. How did the war end for them, and what happened immediately after?
Well, China's commitment, as we discussed, was complicated initially. Chiang admired Germany for a while, But after Stalingrad, and especially after Pearl Harbor brought the U.S. in, China was firmly with the Allies. Their contribution was significant, tying down hundreds of thousands of Japanese troops who could have fought elsewhere. The Allies recognized this, treating China as a major power, renouncing old, unequal treaties, promising the return of Manchuria and Formosa, Taiwan, even giving China a permanent seat on the new UN Security Council.
So on paper, China emerges from WWII looking strong, victorious.
On paper, yes. But the war ended abruptly with the atomic bombs on Japan in August 1945, and instantly the fragile United Front collapsed. The final struggle between the KMT and CCP began almost immediately.
And the expectation, especially in the U.S., was that Chiang would win.
Overwhelmingly. The KMT had a much larger army, control of the major cities, international recognition, and significant U.S. financial and military aid. The Americans even helped airlift KMT troops to take over areas the Japanese surrendered. But there was a complication in Manchuria, the industrial heartland. The Soviet Union had entered the war against Japan right at the end, occupying Manchuria.
And they didn't just hand it over to Chiang.
No. They obstructed the KMT forces trying to move in, while allowing CCP guerrillas, who'd infiltrated from North China, to take control of the countryside and seize weapons surrendered by the Japanese army there. It gave the CCP a crucial strategic foothold.
So the KMT's apparent strength was maybe deceptive.
Very deceptive. Their armies were large, but often poorly trained, badly led, riddled with corruption, and morale was often low, especially among conscripts. By 1948, the Communists, whose People's Liberation Army was now much stronger, better equipped, partly with captured Japanese and KMT weapons, and highly motivated, felt ready. They switched from primarily guerrilla warfare to large-scale conventional battles.
And how did the KMT armies hold up?
They just collapsed. Astonishingly quickly. Under direct pressure, whole divisions disintegrated, surrendered, or defected to the Communists. Morale just evaporated. Key cities fell. Beijing was captured by the Communists in January 1949. The tide had turned completely and irreversibly.
Leaving Chiang with only one option.
Retreat. By the end of 1949, Chiang Kai-shek, along with the remnants of his government and army, about 2 million people in total, fled across the strait to the island of Taiwan, Formosa.
Back in Beijing.
On October 1st, 1949, Mao Zedong stood at Tiananmen, the gate of heavenly peace, and formally proclaimed the founding of the People's Republic of China. He became chairman of the Communist Party and head of state. A new era had begun.
So looking back across those turbulent decades, if you had to summarize the key reasons for the communist triumph, based on Lowe's account.
I'd say it boils down to a few core things.
Right.
One, the CCP's popular appeal, especially their land policy, combined with disciplined, effective, relatively honest administration in the areas they controlled. They offered something tangible to the majority. Two, the KMT's failures. Deep inefficiency, pervasive corruption that alienated people, failure to address the country's core problems, and critical tactical mistakes in the Civil War, like Chiang's disastrous tendency to forbid retreats, leading to huge losses. And three, leadership. Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai provided shrewd, adaptable, and utterly dedicated leadership, supported by very capable military commanders like Lin Biao and Peng Dehuai. They simply outmaneuvered and outfought the KMT leadership.
It truly is an astounding transformation in less than half a century. From this crumbling empire, beset by foreign powers, to the establishment of the People's Republic. A shift that didn't just change China, it changed the entire world map politically.
Absolutely. And Lowe's narrative really underscores that it wasn't some predetermined outcome. It was shaped at every turn by internal conflicts, external pressures, the choices made by leaders, and the vastly different ways the KMT and CCP connected or failed to connect with the Chinese people. History turning on crucial moments.
It makes you think, doesn't it? Consider how often we look back and see history as inevitable. But when you unpack it like this, focusing on the decisions, the alliances, the mistakes, how many other unavoidable outcomes might look very different? What might have happened on China's path to 1949 if just a few key moments had played out differently? Something to ponder.